Settle in and let me tell you a story the old folks still light incense for. It begins, as these things often do, with a storm gathering far to the north, a storm on horseback. For in those days, the Mongols were swallowing the world, one kingdom at a time. Think of it, China had fallen to them. Persia gone, the great city of Baghdad burned, Russian princes bowed. From Korea to the gates of Europe, kings heard the name of the great Khan and went pale. Nobody, it seemed, could stand against the men of the steppe. And yet, far to the south, past the mountains, where the great river spills into the sea, there was a small country of rice paddies and fishing boats. The people there were farmers. They were not many, and soon the storm would turn its eyes toward them. They called their land D-letter-1E-A1, IV, I-letter-1E C7T. It was a place of monsoon rains and muddy rivers, of buffalo in the fields and lanterns on the water. Its people were stubborn in the quiet way that river people often are, bend in the storm, but do not break. They were ruled by the house of TR-1EA7N, a family that had risen, funnily enough, from fishermen, kings who still remembered the smell of the river. And among them was a prince whose name you should remember, because the whole world would come to know it. TR-1EA7N, hung D-letter-1EA1O. He was a soldier, a scholar, and a patient man. And here is a thing worth knowing about him. His own father, on his deathbed, had told him to seize the throne for himself. He never did. When his country needed him whole, he set his family's old grudge aside. That tells you the kind of man he was. The Mongols came the first time in 1258. A raiding army poured down from the north and took the capital, Thang Long. But the VI-letter-1E C7T had already slipped away, leaving an empty city and empty granaries. The heat came, the sickness came, and the Mongols, hungry and worn, turned around and left. It was a warning, though few could read it. The steppe does not forget an insult, and a Khan does not forgive a land that will not kneel. For 30 years, the little kingdom held its breath, and in the north, a far greater storm was being born. His name was Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis, master of the largest empire the world had ever seen, and he wanted the south. In the winter of 1285, he sent an army so vast the histories struggle to count it, under his own son, to grind D-letter-1EA1, IV, I-letter-1E C7T into dust. 500,000 men, some say, war horses beyond counting, the finest army on earth, fresh from conquering China itself, rolling toward a country of farmers. On paper, it was not a war, it was an execution. Everyone knew how this was supposed to end. In the palace, even the brave grew quiet, and the young king, TR-1EA7N Enhan Tong, carrying the weight of every life in his land, turned to the old prince and asked the question a king should never have to ask. Perhaps to spare the people, perhaps we should surrender. And TR-1EA7N hung D-letter-1EA1O gave the answer they would carve into memory. If your majesty wishes to surrender, he said, then first cut off my head, not a boast, a vow. The old man had decided they would fight even the whole world against them. And here is the part I love. The king did not decide alone. They gathered the elders of the land, gray-haired grandfathers from every village, and asked them plainly, fight or surrender, and the old men, with one voice, shouted a single word, fight, darn. The soldiers heard it too. They took ink and needle and tattooed 2 words onto their own forearms, kill the Mongols, so that even in the dark, even in death, they would remember why they stood. An army does not do that for a king, it does that for a home. And the old prince wrote them a letter, a call to his officers that Vietnamese children still learn by heart. He wrote of shame and duty, of full bellies while the enemy walked their land. He wrote until hard men wept and picked up their spears. Words, it turns out, can be a weapon too. Now the old prince was not a fool. He would not throw his farmers against that cavalry in the open. That is exactly how the Mongols won. So he did something that looked, to frightened eyes, like losing. He gave up the capital, again. The people melted into the countryside. They carried off every grain of rice, every duck and buffalo, and burned what they could not carry. When the great Mongol army marched into Thang Long, they found a ghost, a beautiful empty city with nothing to eat and no one to fight. And that was the trap. The steppe horsemen were built for open plains, not for flooded paddies and tangled jungle in the wet, sweltering heat. Their supplies ran thin. Fever crept through the ranks. The mightiest army on earth began, slowly, to starve in a land of plenty that had simply closed its doors. And when the giant was tired and thin and far from home, then the old prince struck. Out of the rivers and the reeds came the men of D-stroke letter 1E A1, IV I letter 1E C7T, hitting the supply lines, the stragglers, the boats. Not one great battle, 1,000 small cuts in the dark from every direction. Battle after battle, the tide turned. The invincible army broke and ran for the border, harried every step of the way. The king came home to his ruined capital, and D-stroke letter 1E A1, IV I letter 1E C7T, against all sense, had survived a second time. But Kublai Khan was not a man who accepted no. 2 years later, in 1288, he came again, and this time he was clever. He knew his army had starved. So this time he sent a great fleet by sea, loaded with food and supplies, hundreds of ships to feed the horde so it could never be starved out again. The whole plan floated on that fleet. TR letter 1EA7N hung D-stroke letter 1EA10 watched and thought and smiled a little, because a fleet must sail up a river to reach the heart of the land. And the old prince knew these rivers the way you know the lines of your own hand. He had been waiting his whole life for an enemy foolish enough to bring ships. There was a river called B letter 1EA1CH, D-stroke letter 1EB1NG. And 300 years before, another Vietnamese hero had won a great victory there against another invader, using a simple, beautiful trick. The old prince knew that story, and he decided that history was about to rhyme. So in the dark, his people went to work. They cut great trunks of ironwood, sharpened them to cruel points, capped them with iron, and drove them into the riverbed, a hidden forest of stakes, buried just beneath the surface at high tide. Then they waited for the moon to pull the water. When the great fleet came, the VI letter 1EC7T sent small boats to meet it, and then, as planned, turned and fled upriver as if in terror. The Mongol admiral, scenting victory, roared his ships forward in pursuit, right over the hidden stakes, while the tide was still high and the trap still drowned. And then the moon did its quiet work. The tide began to fall. Inch by inch, the water sank, and the hidden stakes rose to meet the hulls. Hundreds of great ships shuddered and caught and split open on the iron teeth of the river. The mighty fleet was suddenly a field of trapped and helpless wood. Then the reeds came alive. Fireboats drifted down among the tangled fleet. Arrows rained from both banks. The men of D-stroke letter 1EA1, IV I letter 1EC7T fell upon the trapped ships from every side. What had sailed in as an armada by morning was smoke and splinters by the turning of the tide. It was total. The fleet was destroyed, its commanders captured, the supplies at the bottom of the river. The greatest empire the world had ever known had reached out its hand for this little country 3 times, and 3 times the river had closed its fist. Kublai Khan, they say, wished to try a 4th time. He never did. The old Khan died with the south still unbowed, one of the few corners of the earth his family's horses could not hold. And D-stroke letter 1EA1, IV I letter 1EC7T went back to its rice, and its rivers free. As for the old prince, TR letter 1EA7N hung D-stroke letter 1EA10 lived out his years quietly and died in his bed, an old man surrounded by grandchildren. But his people never let him go. They built temples to him. They lit incense. In time, they called him D-stroke letter 1E9C Than, TR letter 1EA7N, Saint TR letter 1EA7N, and pray to him still. And here is why the old folks still tell it. It was never really a story about one great general, clever as he was. It was a story about a small people who decided together that some things are not for sale, not even to the masters of the world. That quiet stubbornness, the refusal of a small nation to be swallowed, no matter who came, did not die on the B letter 1EA1CH, D stroke letter 1EB1NG. It would be called upon again, in centuries the old prince never saw, whenever the country stood in the shadow of something far larger than itself. But those are stories for other nights. So tonight, let the lanterns burn low. Somewhere, the tide is turning on the B letter 1EA1CH, D stroke letter 1EB1NG, the way it has for 1,000 years, patient and sure. And a small country sleeps beside its river, free, because once, when the whole world came, it simply refused to kneel. Rest now, sleep well.